So now we're going to talk about the development of grammar. Remember, preschoolers are still in the naming explosion stage, learning an average of 9 new words a day. The biggest change from toddlers, however, is the development of complex grammar. So in the preschool years, we start to see new parts of speech. During their third year, children add to their telegraphic sentences. They start to add articles such as a, the, etc., conjunctions and or but, possessive adjectives, mine, his, hers, etc., pronouns, he, she, it, prepositions, on, over, under, etc. So we start to see more than just adjectives, nouns, and verbs. Questions. Children will use the rising pitch at the end of their statements to indicate a question, but they won't use question words until almost 4 years old. An exception to this might be the why. If you've ever been around a 3-year-old, it seems to be the most common word they use. However, just because they use it doesn't mean they mean it the same way you and I would. For them, why is a way to engage in a conversation, a way to express curiosity about a topic. It's sort of a catch-all word for I want to know more about that. Who, what, and where appear earlier than the others, and this reflects cognitive development. So they get the real use of why, when, which, and how later. Passive sentences. Young children have a hard time understanding these, and they don't produce them until middle childhood. An example of a passive sentence would be, the car was hit by the truck. Young children would have a difficult time identifying who hit whom. They prefer active sentences, like the truck hit the car. Complex sentences. The first sentences are usually just 2 words that get the point across, those telegraphic sentences. 3-year-olds may use sentences that contain 10 words or more, but they're usually still without the adult grammar. Again, it's variant on the child. Some children are very eloquent earlier than others and use more complex speech earlier than others. Again, I'm just telling you what's typical. Grammatical morphemes. These are words or endings of words that make a sentence grammatical, like ing, ed, or the s to indicate a plural. Children tend to get these during the toddler and preschool years. Children have an amazing ability to learn the rules of these grammatical morphemes, such as adding an s to make something plural or an ed to make it past tense. They can then apply these rules to new words, even if they've never heard that form of the word before. Think about very young children you know. Do they say we went to the zoo? No, they say we goed to the zoo. This is called overregularization. Children don't learn grammar by rote or memorization. They learn the rules of grammar and apply them, sometimes incorrectly. So you'll hear words like gooder or goed or teached. The application of regular rules of grammar to irregular verbs and nouns, such as past tense and plurals. Okay? This shows an understanding of grammar, not a deficit. It's not a bad thing. Again, teached versus taught, mouses versus mice. There are a lot of other examples, especially in the English language. It is full of irregular nouns and verbs. So children must learn not only the rules of grammar for their language, but also the exceptions to those rules. Again, English is really, really bad at this. So anyone learning a foreign language and struggling with this, it's really hard to learn the exceptions to rules. Upon hearing the correct usage, they will gradually use them the correct way too. Correcting them constantly can lead to shame and hinder language development. Just keep using the correct words and they will correct themselves eventually without shame. So how do children actually learn grammar? Well, the behaviorists have an answer to that. They say it's through operant conditioning. They say something that sounds like a word, they get a reward in form of approval for adults, and they're more likely to do it again. We've talked about this in how they learn language. So they imitate through social learning. So this may be part of how children learn grammar, but children don't imitate adult grammar. Remember what we just talked about with the rules and how they mess up the rules of grammar. So behaviorism can't be the whole answer. So the linguistic answer. They would say that children are born with the mechanisms to learn language. It's wired into the brain. Grammar is not built in, but the process of learning it is. There's evidence that supports this idea, but we can't prove it. Some of the evidence is that regions in the left hemisphere, remember that's responsible for language, light up when simple grammar rules are broken. Attempts to teach grammar to chimps have only been slightly successful, suggesting the mechanism is unique to humans. And the period from birth to 12 years old has been shown to be a critical period for language and grammar. After this, children who have not yet learned a language will never be able to master it. The story of Jeannie illustrates this. The cognitive answer. Children learn by recognizing patterns in the speech they hear. Learning that S is always added to a noun to mean more than one of that noun, so they create the rule in their head, noun plus S equals plural. They learn by searching for the patterns in their memory and copying them, not from an inborn grammar learning device. So this one looks more at the children like a computer. They search their language for patterns and then create sort of an algorithm in their brain for how to deal with the patterns. The social interaction answer. This says that learning takes place in the interaction between children and adults. Children want to convey ideas, adults want to understand, so they work together to form language. So what do you think? Is it just one of these things? Likely it's a mixture of all of them. There is no one correct answer for how we learn grammar and language. So now we're going to talk about the pragmatics of language. We've mentioned them briefly before. These are the rules for how we use language every day. It's the social rules of language. So how are they learned? Well, children learn pragmatics from interacting with adults, from being read to, watching TV, etc. There's a lot of social learning involved. Primitive cognitive strategies for learning language can produce the right use of the word or the wrong use. So we need to learn the right usage through learning by observation. So the social rules of talking. Some are easy, such as taking turns when talking, and even babies understand that rule. But some are beyond the abilities of a toddler or a preschooler. There's something called the answer obviousness rule. If the answer to the question is obvious from the context and the speaker, then the question should be interpreted as a request or a demand. For example, a parent goes into a kid's room and says, "Do you really have to bang that so hard?" A 4 or 5-year-old will understand that the speaker wants him to stop banging, but the 2 or 3-year-old does not. So the 2 or 3-year-old will just look up and say yes. Another rule of language is saying something relevant to the topic being discussed, and you'll notice that young children are very bad about this. They'll say whatever's on their mind, even if it had nothing to do with the conversation that was just happening. Another rule is saying something new and not repeating what has just been said. Toddlers tend to repeat a lot of what's just been said. Again, it's just a way of them indicating that they're listening and they want to contribute to the conversation, but they don't know how. And it's important to remember that some language rules, the pragmatics, vary by culture. Each culture has its own social rules for language. Effective communication relies on 3 things that children have to learn and that are part of the pragmatics of language. And we'll go into each one in more depth, but those 3 things are taking turns, which means alternating as speaker and listener. When speaking, remarks should be clear to the listener, and listeners should let speakers know when their remarks don't make sense. Complete mastery of this may never occur, but let's talk about how children learn these. The first is taking turns. Even infants learn about turn taking. Most parents do it with them automatically. For toddlers, parents may teach them about taking turns by holding both sides of the conversation. You might have heard a parent talk to a child that way, like they're holding both ends up. As I said before, preschoolers will engage in turn taking, even if they're not actually holding a conversation with each other. If they're in that collective monologue, they'll still take turns. Often, if a preschooler doesn't get a response to a comment, they'll just keep repeating it until they do get a response. The second part was speaking effectively. Infants attempt to communicate with gestures and sounds. Toddlers will start conversations, but remember they're very egocentric. Preschoolers learn to adjust their comments depending on the listener, and they're learning that not everyone has the same information. That comes from theory of mind, and that they may have to provide it. However, learning to accurately convey a message can be challenging and frustrating. The third is listening well. Preschoolers have a hard time with this. They don't really understand when a message is ambiguous. Example, you tell them, "Find the red toy." An adult might ask, "Which red toy?" But a preschooler will just grab the toy they think the speaker wanted. So they really haven't learned yet to ask for elaboration on language. So the use of language, how do they use it? Well, egocentrism in language. So preschoolers have the ability to adapt their speech to their listeners. Toddlers do not, because of egocentrism and the lack of theory of mind. So this means that a toddler will talk the same way to everyone, but a preschooler learns to talk to a friend differently than they do to a teacher, a sign that they're moving past egocentrism. However, preschoolers still show egocentrism in their language through what's called collective monologues. This means that they take turns talking, but they aren't really engaging with each other. So, example, two preschool children are playing right next to each other. One is playing with a coloring book and the other with a doll. They are talking to each other in sequence, but each child is completely oblivious to what the other is saying. Julie says, "I love my dolly. Her name is Tina." Carol says, "I'm going to color the sun yellow." Julie says, "She has long curly hair like my auntie." Carol says, "Maybe I'll color the trees yellow too." And they go on like this. They're each holding a conversation about their own topic, and they're taking turns talking, but they're not really communicating with each other. And you've probably heard adults doing something similar to this, sometimes too. So this type of monologue demonstrates the egocentrism of children's thinking in this stage. So what's the purpose of language to them? Children use language to express their feelings, to describe objects and events, to please adults, and to express thoughts and wishes. Speech also connects children to symbolic thought. Again, self-talk. Preschoolers use this a lot. This is what Vygotsky called private speech. Again, it begins around the ages of 2 or 3. This helps build language skills and cognitive processes. Connections between speech, actions, and objects are being made and reinforced. Private speech helps delay gratification, helps with motivation, helps regulate emotions. It helps children make sense of the world. Again, it's a good thing. Let them do it. Gender differences. Girls tend to start talking earlier than boys and use longer sentences earlier. In girls' brains, Broca and Wernicke's areas are larger. This could be due to nature or nurture. And females tend to use both hemispheres in speech, while males mostly use the left. Remember, the left hemisphere deals with the literal meanings of words, whereas the right deals with nuances such as tone of voice, inflection, and body language. So can you see how this difference might lead to miscommunication? There are also culture influences. Girls hear more language. They are talked to more often, even as babies. Girls are talked to about emotions more often than boys, and girls are given social toys to play with, dolls, pretend play, etc., games that involve language. There are individual differences. Some children are just more talkative than others. Some take longer to develop language. Variation in language use is based on temperament, personality, siblings, family size, whether they're an extrovert or an introvert, if they have higher linguistic intelligence. Some children use speech more as expression, some are more utilitarian. There's a lot of individual differences in how children speak. Okay, we will finish this topic in the next lecture.